Hello and welcome to the first episode of Knee Deep in the Pod. I'm Dan.
And I'm Chris.
And Chris, why don't you just tell us a little bit about what this podcast is all about?
Yeah, so this podcast really is an opportunity for me and Dan to just talk endlessly about games. Mostly games from our past and our experience. We both played a lot of games growing up and a lot of those games together. So we thought, hey, we love having these conversations anyway. Let's turn it into a podcast and have these conversations in a way that people can listen to and enjoy.
And Chris, what qualifies you to talk about video games?
Yeah, so I describe myself as a time-poor gamer these days. Have a wife and 2 kids, full-time job and all the rest of it. So, but whenever I can, I try and squeeze in time to play games. I grew up playing games, a lot of the time playing with Dan and his brothers. So yeah, that's where I'm coming from. Dan, tell me what qualifies you to be on this podcast.
Well, much like yourself, I find I don't have a lot of time to play games these days, but games were a really important part of my childhood. I'd still consider myself a gamer, 100%, and I work in the games industry.
Wicked. And I think, as the podcast rolls on, in this episode and further, I'm sure we'll touch on some of the stuff you've done, because some great examples there. So welcome to episode 1, or E1 S1, as I'm going to call it.
What's the S for?
Series 1. I'm being optimistic. There's going to be more than one series.
Okay. So, the topic for today's episode is, are old games as fun as we remember them being? Obviously, we have a lot of nostalgia towards some of our old favourites, and I think that can sort of colour our perception. But, I still play some old games today. I still enjoy them. I'm sure the same is true for you. So, we just thought we'd take a super general look at old games just to kick off this whole podcast, because before we start diving into like super niche topics, it'd be good to just have something a bit general.
Yeah, I try not to scare people off too soon. And what I wonder, I don't know if this is a spicy topic or not. To some people it might be kind of spicy. It's like, leave the old games of the past. Like, look what is available now. And maybe it's just a conversation that old people have. But hey, we still play old games. I still play old games. I would say, I'm just pulling a number out of the air, but I would say probably 50% of the gaming time that I have, I devote to older games. Often games from my childhood, but not always. So yeah, let's talk about it. So let's try and set some ground rules. And I don't actually know the answer to these questions yet, but what is an old game? How old are we going? What defines, what defines kind of old, I guess, in the context of this discussion?
Yeah, that's a really great question to start with, because I think about some of the games I play and I don't think of them as old, and then I realize they're like 20 years old. Which is, I think 100%. That's got to count as old.
It has, yeah.
I don't want to admit it, but 20 years is a long time.
Old. It is old. But I think, this is, maybe we touch on this in a bit, but there's a certain level of like graphical competence, I guess, or graphical achievement that, like, beyond that, I'm just once a game has achieved that, I kind of don't think of it as like,
it's kind of time, becomes timeless in a way.
Yeah, and I think it's almost like a point. I couldn't put a year to it, but like maybe it's kind of the early to mid 2000s or something. There's like, like this is not. I don't consider Modern Warfare, Call of Duty Modern Warfare, an old game, for example. Mind you, it probably it was around when I was at university. So we're talking. It's like it's at least 10 years old, but it's probably like 50, bit more than that now. Anyway, but the level of graphical, achievement there is like, to my perspective, like really high. In that I don't look at it and think and see all the the things that could be better, or the things that aren't good enough, or the things that are like, I guess, taking me out of the experience. And I could say that for games even older than that, for sure. And it's just there's enough there for me to just be like, yeah, I believe it, and I just get it.
Yeah.
And now let's get on with the game. And there's almost like that element for me with some games that's just like, even though they are old, they're old, but I don't kind of see see the oldness in them. Anyway, so we should. I don't know if we can put a year to it, but let me just start by saying some things that I think I'm going to include in the bucket, and we'll go from there. So, I guess DOS games, it's probably pretty fair to say that DOS games, all belong kind of in this bucket. Kind of Windows, I'm kind of thinking Windows 95, 98, and I guess before, not that I really kind of engaged with computers so much before that, but then I would also include like the SNES and the NES, and in that, and I guess that kind of generation of consoles. But then where's the cut? PlayStation 1, I kind of think that I guess that's old. Is PlayStation 2 old? I mean, some people would maybe load up this podcast and be like, "What are you talking about? I wasn't even born." When the PlayStation 2 came out.
We're on the PS5 now.
Mm-hmm. So I don't know. Can you add anything to that? I don't know if we can.
Yeah. I think it's safe to say, like you say, DOS games old, Windows 95 old, Super Nintendo old. Probably to the average modern gamer, anything made older than before like 5 years ago is an old game. But I think for the sake of this podcast, when we talk about old games, we're really thinking like 15, 20 years old, right?
Yeah, that's a good ballpark. Yeah, yeah. Man, I'm sorry to like derail us straight away, but like to what you were saying, like gamers, even like something that's like 5 years ago is like old, right? I think of Doom 2016 as like a new game, but that's like what, 7 years old now?
Oh my goodness,
7 years. But it feels like bang up to date to me.
I only completed it 6 months ago.
Yeah, right.
That's the thing.
Anyway.
Like, I have such a backlog of games that by the time I get around to playing them, the rest of the world has moved on.
100%. And actually, I think that's a good that's a good thing we should weave into this conversation, actually, because I think part of what makes old games fun. Are they really as fun as we remember? I think a big part of what makes games fun, full stop, is sharing them with your friends. And like multiplayer is obviously a big part of that, but even single player stuff. But then that you can discuss your experiences with your friends. Like I don't know, Morrowind or Oblivion. They are single player games, and they're people will just plow hours into them because they're huge. But you enjoy them. I think part of the enjoyment is like talking to your friend that has also played the game, and it's like, oh, what route did you take? What quests have you done? And what did you choose for your character? Whatever.
For sure.
And I think a lot of that. I guess a lot of the stuff with the old games we're going to be talking about is, we shared them a lot with our friends because they were what you did when you went around a friend's house, or maybe you played the multiplayer or whatever. So yeah, I think that's part of the thing that's kind of tied in with this. And I think people do still play games together now, obviously, but I guess certainly we maybe did more gaming together and with our friends when we were younger. So maybe there's an age thing in there.
It was a very different experience playing games multiplayer back in the day, and perhaps we can come on to that a bit later.
So we've touched on this already, but so do we play old games today? We've both said yes. Why? I guess. Why do we still play them?
I will answer that, but I just want to quickly go back to something you mentioned earlier. You said that some people these days might say, leave old games in the past. And I've got an interesting story about this because, as you know, I'm remaking an old game in my spare time. It's been a hobby project of mine for a number of years now. It's a very obscure real-time strategy game called Rival Realms. And I'm remaking it for various reasons, but partly just to modernize it, make sure it works with modern operating systems, because a lot of games these days don't. A lot of old games now don't work. But the interesting thing that happened was I actually got in touch with the original developer, one of the original developers of this game. And we had a bit of a chat. And he basically said to me, "Why are you doing this?" Like, he was like, "It's not that good of a game. Why don't you just make something better?" And I was so shocked by that, because this game is so special to me. And I really want to play it again. And play it, multiplayer, and have all these great experiences that I believe it has the potential for. But he just didn't see it. I mean, to him, it was just, I guess it was just a job at the time, and it was just a game that they made to compete with other games of the time, and it flopped, and that was that.
It's brutal, isn't it? It's hard. I mean, I guess we played it, when we were young, and also we just spent hours on it, and that helps, it just kind of build affection for it. But also, I don't know, well, it just reminds me of a quote, John Romero, I think, said he kind of has got a bit of a tip when it comes to game development, and that is, if the office are like playing it constantly, if the team that are like developing it are playing it in their spare time, or even, dare I say, like wasting a bit of company time playing the game when maybe they should be working on the game, you've got a good game.
That's a great sign, yeah.
Yeah, like people want to play it, even when they're kind of working on it day in, day out. So, hey, I can't speak for what was in the office at the Rival Realms, development team, but, maybe they weren't playing it as much, maybe they weren't playing it that much. Or maybe, maybe it is just that thing, just like, move on. Maybe that is just, and that is quite a tech industry thing, I guess, like it's always progressing, it's always moving on. Today, maybe you're right, maybe it was just a job.
Yeah, and it's tough, because there certainly is a lot that we could move on to. There's games coming out all the time with better graphics, more modern gameplay and features. So I can sympathize with someone who says, "Why don't you just move on and play something new?" I get it. But I think that just because something is old doesn't mean it has to stop being fun. If it was fun then, why can't it be fun now?
That's great. That's a great quote. Yeah, doesn't have to stop. If it just because something's old doesn't mean it has to stop being fun.
I don't know if this is a good analogy or not, but we have cars now, but people still ride horses. Is that a bad analogy?
No, I think that's fair. I mean, it is quite niche, but no, I mean, and there are games that people have been playing for years that outside the context of technology, like computers and stuff. People have been playing the same sports for 100 years or longer, so that's still fun. Why should a game that's a bit old on a PC not be fun anymore?
Yeah, and something you touched on was, I think there's like a threshold where a game's graphics, they either age well or they don't. There's some games, particularly early 3D games, haven't aged well at all. But then others have a more kind of timeless art style, which helps, I think, with their longevity.
100%. There are some games I cannot return to. Like, it's so bad.
Go on, name names.
How they look. Oh gosh, I couldn't even name the name. I just remember. Do you remember back in the day? Do you remember when we were? You know how old we are. When you would go to a shop, you would walk into a shop and buy. I suppose you can still do this and buy your console game. You buy the disc, and sometimes you go on there, you go there because a friend has the game and you want the game. Great, you've experienced it a bit. But sometimes you go and you don't know. You're just going by what's on the box art or what was on the back.
You just take something out of the 2 for £10 section. Hope for the best.
And I've grabbed some corkers through that method, and there was one in particular. I cannot remember the title, but I just even then I couldn't bear to look at it. Really, it was just so blocky. It was a PS1 game. It was so blocky, and it was I think it was a bit like a sci-fi alien type thing, but it was just hideous to look at. Just awful textures and graphics stretched over like cubes. It was just hideous. So I could barely deal with it then, let alone now. Like, it's just not even worthy of your time. Whereas some games, as you say, like I think there's a whole, as you say, there's like a group of games that were just like early doors 3D, which were just ugly to look at. Really, even at the time. Whereas there are other games that had a more artistic flair. I think even like Crash Bandicoot 1, which there are some limitations, and you can tell playing that game, and like even the art of Crash is pretty like it's quite severe, and they kind of soften his face and like how he looks a bit in the coming titles. But even that, it's like there's a style and there's a flair to it, and you kind of you just get it and you just buy into it, and then it's like, I don't care, this doesn't look, this isn't like full HD perfect graphics. There's just like enough like style about it that it's like, yeah, cool. But even like, but going back even further, like, I mean, what one game, Heroes of Might and Magic, 3 in particular is the one that I've spent most time with. Is, to my eye, is just beautiful, and like it is a bit pixelated, and it's it could, you could put more detail in, and they've tried, and with varied degrees of success. But it's just, the style of it is just spot on. There's an artistic like vision for the game, and they absolutely like they achieve it, and they do the very best in that game of like 2D art at the time, and it's just like to me it's like so great. And I don't, coming back to it, that game must be 20 years old now, maybe longer, and I don't struggle, Some games, like, you kind of come to it and you're like, I'm having to like force my way past the visual thing, because it's like, it's a distraction, and I don't find it a distraction in that game. But then, like, go back to some DOS games, and Doom as an example, or maybe Lemmings as well. I don't know. I'm just trying to think, like Doom. There's definitely a conversation already in that some people touch on the internet. That's like, it doesn't really look like anything in particular. Like, it's nothing. There's very little in the game that's like recognizable as like a thing in the real world, right? Like, I guess there are barrels, and oil barrels are a real thing. And yet kind of general structures, but like tables and chairs aren't really a thing in that game, and like even like the sci-fi consoles are pretty like, they're pretty abstract. There's a lot of abstract, I guess, is kind of what I'm getting at. But you just kind of accept it. That's it. It's interesting that like I don't know what it is. You dive right into the game and you just kind of take it for what it is and carry on. And maybe a modern gamer, a younger gamer would just dive into that game and just be like, what is this? I just can't get over it. But I don't find that at all. And I just kind of accept the game for what it is, and then just dive into the gameplay. And I think we can veer off into that conversation really about like graphics versus gameplay, and how much does it matter? How much do the graphics matter if the gameplay is really great? Or vice versa, if a game has like wonderful graphics, does it not need quite so much such great gameplay maybe? But certainly a lot of the games that I come back to that are older games, I think the gameplay is excellent, and that's what keeps bringing me back, I guess.
Yeah. Do you know what? It had never really occurred to me about Doom that the places are so abstract, as you say. Like you said, I just kind of accepted it. But actually, thinking about it, when I stop and reflect, I realize that's something I really like about not just Doom, but older or less detailed games in general, is the lack of detail means that everything that's important in the game world stands out a lot more. It's a lot more readable. Whereas if you have a very detailed game world, some of the details which are not important to the gameplay kind of confuse the readability of the scene a little bit. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And I think, you're not just making that up either. It's apologies to keep bringing it up, but like Doom 2016 and Doom Eternal both go to great efforts actually to like call stuff out to the player. And I think that's partly as like kind of in response to exactly what you've just said there. When there's so much detail and like interest and like in the world and in the graphical content, then it is harder to see things. And so like often they'll highlight ledges that you need, like, oh, this is a ledge that you need to jump up to, by the way. There are like green lights. It's like there are flashing green lights to be like, go here. And you still kind of have to look for them a little, but I think that is absolutely a reality, and games are having to employ strategies like that to like assist the player in like, oh, this is where I need to go. Because you're right, when there's less detail, when everything's really blocky and just like it's like, oh, that's obviously like, I've got two options.
I've got a door, a barrel, and a lift.
Yeah. Whereas, you can get a bit turned around or like lost in these kind of detailed places sometimes. And there's a joy to it as well. I don't want to like take away from that. And that there is a whole load of cool stuff that comes with that kind of more realism thing. But yeah, there is also there's quite a fundamental joy in just like, it's simple. Like it's this or this, and I can see it straight off.
Yeah, you're right. There is something very enjoyable as well about exploring a realistic world, and that has an appeal of its own. But yeah, the kind of lower detail, increased readability definitely has its advantages. And you're absolutely right. Like level designers these days have to employ a lot of tricks to guide the player, and that's something that I see every day in my job. Yeah,
absolutely. And I wonder, is it with creativity, and this is a broader point now, but like, in my spare time, I'm a musician as well. And, I often read about limitations, like being a big part of creativity. And like, you impose your constraints and then the creativity can happen. And often like having like all options available to you can actually be like it can be like against the creative process. It's like, it's too much. It's overwhelming. Or I don't have to be creative, as creative because, I can just do whatever. Whereas I think, with older games, there were hardware constraints, absolutely, that, prevented certain things from being achieved, or you'd have to achieve them in like, certain ways, which maybe dictated how some, how levels were constructed, or, I guess, like what kind of features there were in a game in terms of, even just like looking up and down, or like, or like mechanics, I guess, mechanics in a game were kind of more limited, or were even like to some degree, that what was possible kind of to some degree dictated the games that were made. It's like, oh, this is what we can do. How can we like turn this thing into like something that's fun?
Absolutely. That's actually one of the reasons why the developers of Minecraft have rejected a lot of ideas. People have asked for like, I don't know, like a chair block or a table block. And that's been rejected because, like you say, limitations enhance creativity. And so by having a very limited block palette, it forces players to use their imaginations a bit more.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, I think you definitely, you see that. And I don't know. like original Doom, for example, you can't look up and down. You have to it kind of auto does that. If there is like verticality, which there is, then it kind of automatically does that for you. And I don't get frustrated at that. To be honest, when I'm playing, I barely even notice it. I just accept that, it's just part of the game, and you move on. So yeah, I don't know. With like some like exceptions, or some like I don't think graphics matters. Basically, I don't think graphics matters very much. With some exceptions, and some things are just horrible to look at always. But mostly, I think if a game has strong gameplay, then the visuals, just they need to do a job, and if they convey an element of style and flair, then I think all the better. And I think a lot of older games achieve that, so it's kind of not a problem.
Yeah, I would say that graphics can contribute a lot to my enjoyment of the game, but they're not essential for my enjoyment. And they also, when I say that graphics can contribute to my enjoyment, I don't mean that they have to be realistic. They could be stylized, they could be whatever. I'm just saying, like, there are definitely games that I've enjoyed in part because of their graphics or their particular like aesthetic style that they're going for. But you 100%. Can have a great game with terrible graphics, it's not important for enjoyment.
Yeah. I mean, there are some games where like kind of how it looks and how like spectacular it looks is kind of a big part of it. Like certainly, I mean, the gameplay in the Elder Scrolls games is also great, but certainly like each time an Elder Scrolls game comes out, it's like, wow, look at the detail, look at how beautiful it is, and and there are other games besides, and I guess things maybe even like games like that kind of might be described as walking simulators, and there are other things like that. There's just like the beauty and just like the experience of being in the place. Is a big part of the game, and I guess with older games, you would there's probably few to none games that would like fit that genre, because it wasn't really possible, and so you just didn't have games that did that stuff. So yeah, don't want to like completely discount graphics at all. But yeah, there's a lot of, I guess there's a lot of room to maneuver in that spectrum, and and it's still very, you can still have really enjoyable games.
Can you think of a game that has particularly bad graphics that you've still really enjoyed, and also a game that you've enjoyed in part because of the graphics?
So I think that enjoyed in part because of the graphics is probably easier, and I think certainly like Morrowind or Skyrim when it first came out was like was pretty groundbreaking, and like water and stuff, but like even newer games as well since then have done water even better, and it's just like a beautiful sight to behold. So a game that I enjoyed despite the graphics is that that's tough.
Yeah.
You might have to take over from me for a second whilst I think about that.
Sure. Well, I wanted to actually offer up a game that I've enjoyed largely because of the graphics, and that's Firewatch. Because in terms of gameplay, it's basically a walking simulator, but it's just stunning to look at, and I just loved being in that world.
Absolutely.
A game that I've enjoyed despite the graphics. This is a bit of a cheeky one, but I would say probably one of the games that I've made. Like, we used to spend hours playing this little jousting game that I made, and the graphics were just something I knocked up in Microsoft Paint in about 5 minutes, but it was just so fun.
It served the purpose, didn't it? Like, no one would look at that and be like, that's a beautiful piece of art, but no, you're right. And you know what? That reminds me, probably Lero, I think. Like, Lero, it's pretty basic. Particularly, I think there was two. Was there Lero Extreme that was like the sequel or something? But original Lero is so basic. Actually, you know what? So, like, on a similar wormy type vibe, the original Worms game is not a treat to look at all. Worms Armageddon, I think came straight after. Maybe there might be an intervening game there, but that's actually like it's quite very cartoony, very stylistic, and like even now, like you could play that game and just be like, yeah, some indie developer made this and it have chosen a style and run with it, and it looks great. So that looks great. Original Worms is pretty hideous.
You could barely see that they were worms, could you?
No, it was just like they were just pink lines.
If the game wasn't called Worms, I wouldn't be any the wiser.
Yeah, they didn't keep shoving like big artwork of worms like in the loading screens. You'd have no.
Like they're really trying to just hammer the point home. Don't worry, guys, these are worms.
It really is. Yeah. So there you go. That's my answer. I think. Yeah, not good graphics. And there's some. But it amazes me the tricks that old games play, though, man. And like some of the stuff they did, like. I loathe to kind of keep bringing up Doom, but I'll move to some others. But like the amount of things that were like scanned, or like like photos were like taken and then like kind of transformed into graphics. And I think it similarly, Abe's Odyssey did a lot of kind of interesting stuff like that. Then like and like a way of kind of creating quite detailed graphics but without kind of having to programmatically generate it or in kind of save, kind of computing resource and stuff. So like the creativity that goes into like shortcutting, like computer load and stuff, particularly back then I love that stuff.
And in the case of Doom, it caused them quite a lot of trouble, didn't it? Because they obviously, to scan an imp, they had to open up a portal to hell. Yeah,
which is always, as you know, is always tinged with danger.
Yeah, quite perilous.
They were just willing to go the extra mile for that, to get that game over the line, and all credit to them. Just through the shores of hell. Right, so let's get on to something a bit spicy. Things that old games did right that new games get very wrong.
Ooh. Difficulty. I'm just going to come out and say it.
Yeah, you do. Yes, you do.
Modern games are, in general, much easier than old games, I think. And I think that there's a commercial reason for that, because they want the game to be accessible to as wide an audience as possible so they can sell more copies, make more money. So in order to do that, they make the games easier. And you see things like adaptive difficulty, where if you die enough times, all the enemies get significantly easier. Or difficulty levels that you can change at will in the menu screens. Or in the most diabolical case, which is Nintendo's new Super Mario Bros. Wii, if you die enough times, Luigi comes along and plays the level for you.
What?
Yeah, you can just hit this like Luigi help box and he will play the level for you, and at any point you can just jump in and take over. Or not.
That just reinforces the view I've always had, which is that Luigi is the superior of the two brothers. But for a gameplay point of view, I'm not into it. So, wow. So yeah, absolutely, and I do get it. It's expensive to make a game. You need to sell games. It kind of, but like. I'm kind of, I have two minds about it sometimes, because, like, I don't know. I think you really enjoy games when you are like acing it against a game that is hard, and I think old games like largely do not shy away from that. Often they are hard, and actually you forget how hard they are, and you come back and you're like, it takes a while to get back into it because you're like, wow, this game is kicking my ass. But yeah, like old games were hard. And like I think part of the enjoyment is like just like getting great at the game and owning the game, but also I think maybe some of the nostalgia and also some of the familiarity with those games is probably because of the amount of times we have replayed levels like again and again and again because we died You know, we died so many times, and it's like, oh, we've got to do it again, and you learn. And you know, when you're a kid, you know, you're maybe not that great at games. You know, there are levels that I've come back to that I'm just like, why did I find this hard? But at the time, it was like, this is the hardest thing in the world. You know, it's so hard. But yeah, but there's so much like, I don't know, so much nostalgia and so much like familiarity and like experience wrapped up in that, you know, of like, you know, just doing the same level loads of times, then eventually you make it and it's like, yes. But I do have sympathy for it as well, because like, you know, now I'm an older person now, I'm an older man, and I don't have as much time, and you know, the precious time that I can spend on gaming, like, do I want to get my ass kicked for an hour, you know, or half an hour, whatever it is, you know, until I manage to beat the level? Sometimes, yeah. Sometimes I'm in that mood, but sometimes really no. I just like, you know, it's been a long day. I want like just an enjoyable, easy gaming experience, you know?
Yeah, it's a super difficult balance, because if it's too easy, then there's no satisfaction at all. And to me, that's just not fun. I appreciate different people might have different opinions. I like a bit more of a challenge. But if it's too hard as well, then it can get frustrating. And especially if, like you say, you just don't have time for a long session. You want to be making progress. Do you have a game in mind that you remember being particularly grueling?
I think, you know, Mario is pretty grueling at times, for sure. Doom is hard, actually. Doom is a tough game. But also, and here we go, niche alert, Knights and Merchants, man. So Knights and Merchants, for the listeners that are not aware, this is a real-time strategy game from the 90s. And there is no difficulty choice. It's just, you know, it is what it is. You're playing the game. And I just, you know, Dan will remember too, like, there was a level we were stuck on for so long. Weeks and months and longer. And there was just like, whenever we tried, we failed, and we'd try again and we'd fail in a different way, and we'd try again and we'd fail in the same way we did the first time.
For reference, this was level 4. You know, we weren't very far into the game.
No. And I just like the sheer joy that came upon me when like it looked like we might do it. Like, it wasn't even a dead cert yet, but I'd like got further than ever before. And I had to like pause the game, save it, run downstairs and proclaim, I think to both of our mums at the time. I think both of our mums were in the house or something. And I was like, it's so important, and let me tell you why. It's amazing. And, you know, probably like I would now to my kids, you know, it's like, oh, that's so great. Yeah, I have no idea what you're talking about. You know, like, yeah. But like, you know, it was so important though. It was so important to us. And, you know, achieving that, you know, and we did that time. We beat the level, and it was just like the best feeling in the world. It was amazing. And yeah.
Yeah, beating level 4 of Knights and Merchants was a huge deal for us because it was so hard. And and as a result, that's created a very fond memory for both of us.
Absolutely. And similarly, I've not quite got the same, you know, imprint in my mind, but level 5 also was one we were stuck on for ages, and, you know, finally beating that was another like big moment. I think by then beating that level was like I'd sort of gotten to a point in the game it had taught me enough lessons to then, you know, progress a fair bit further. But yeah, just like, and that's something to touch on as well. So we talked about difficulty. I mean, and there are a whole bunch. We could talk for ages about the different types. You know, as you say, kind of progressive and adaptive stuff. That, you know, and the thing with like where enemies progress. You know, I played a game recently, Immortals: Phoenix Rising, which is actually quite a relatively modern game within the last kind of two or 3 years. That, you know, the enemies kind of scale up with you. There's like some element of like, you know, different areas. Kind of maybe they're capped, or I'm not exactly sure how it works. But, you know, there's like, the idea is you can kind of go most places, and you can kind of roughly take it because, you know, they scale with you, right? And like, I mean, I'm not exactly sure how I feel about that, because like, you know, to one degree you want to get better and then be able to like kick the ass of, you know, people that beat you up in the past, and it's like, hey, look, I'm so great, and it maybe limits that to some degree, and that kind of feeling of accomplishment maybe. But yeah, and then one thing I just want to touch on though with difficulty is like, I guess game developers could say, and they do, it's like, well, if you want it to be harder, you can just select, there's a harder difficulty just there, you just choose it. And I don't know what, like, I can't quite tell, I can't verbalize it. I don't want to choose the harder difficulty. I want the normal difficulty to be like right. I want that to be right, and then I want the harder difficulty basically to be there for when I've played the game once. I've become pretty good at it because I played it at normal difficulty, which was the right level of challenge, and then I hit hard. I don't want it to be like dumbed down so much that it's just it's too easy at regular difficulty, and so I have to choose like hard or very hard for it to be like the right level of challenge. I guess that's just all in my head, but it's just, I don't like, maybe other people don't feel that way, but it's just like, it's so like ingrained in me. Like, I shouldn't have to choose the harder difficulty for it to be right. Like, that should be like, you've achieved being good enough to do hard difficulty.
You have to earn it.
Yeah, man. You can't just like, I don't think you should just be able to stroll in and just do like hard or very hard, whatever they're called, the difficulty ratings. I guess, there's a context where, like, maybe it's a first-person shooter. You play first-person shooters all the time, of like different developers and whatever, and you just have a base level of skill for that kind of game, and so fine, you go in on hard or hardest, whatever.
Do you kind of also have similar feelings about the easy difficulties? Like you're reluctant to choose them because you'll feel like a chump?
I am reluctant to choose easy. Yeah, I do. I think it is. It's like admitting defeat a little bit there.
I think on Abacus, which is the game that I've released, the easy difficulty was literally called chump. or there was some text which said for chumps, Yeah.
I think it was for chumps. That's so good. Yeah, there's a whole like mental thing just wrapped up in that, but yeah, the other thing that I think old games did not shy away from, and this is not always to their this is not always for the better, a lot of the time they do not tell you how to play the game. Tutorials are limited at best.
That's true.
And there's some I think again there's a balance thing there. And some new games would, or developers would kind of say, well, hey, all the help is here, but look, it's all skippable, or you can always just ignore it. But again, I don't really want to ignore it. I want the right amount to be there, and then for me not to have to think about it. Which I guess I get that that's tough from their point of view, but equally, playing Metroid 2, I forget exactly what it's called, the full title, but the one that's on the...
This is an old game?
Yeah, this is an old game on the SNES. It is available on the mini SNES, which is the platform I played it on. This is where Metroidvania games come from, if that's a genre that you are familiar with. Dan actually introduced me to that genre title. I had no idea that that's what it was when I played it. But yeah, it's a Metroidvania game. Metroid started it all. So that game, there are a few elements, a few times there where it just does not tell you. It really doesn't tell you. I mean, like you pick up skills along the way, and it kind of it kind of roughly teaches you once. But it does not handhold you at all, that game. And there are moments where you feel like a badass because like you worked it out. Like you had the different skills that you got from different places, and then like, oh, if I do all these things, then great. But then there are times when like it's really not obvious, and you're just stuck, and it's frustrating, it's boring eventually. And then there are times when it's just like, hey, the way to complete this section is something we have never taught you. It's just, you just got to work it out, buddy, and that's it.
Yeah.
And that is, that's less than great. But So there's a balance, but or I guess all I would say, without trying to like define what the right balance is in this conversation, is just like there is there's a really cool feeling of working stuff out, not being told, and you just dive in and you work stuff out as you go, and that kind of feeling of discovery is great. There's also frustrations when you don't get enough of a hint, and you just get stuck, and like being stuck is not fun.
Yeah, it's definitely a balance, as with seemingly everything that we've talked about so far. I do find personally that modern games typically are a bit too heavy-handed with the tutorials, and that's something that annoys me a lot, actually, because I just want to play the game. But you're just constantly being bombarded with tutorial messages that are telling you these really basic things. And often they don't even give you a chance to work stuff out for yourself, because they just tell you everything and more. And even I was playing Jedi Survivor recently, and there are certain puzzles, and we're not talking difficult puzzles, we're talking like really freaking obvious stuff. But if you haven't solved it within a minute or two, it just pops up with a message saying, do you want the solution?
Yeah.
And I find that annoying, because I'm like, no, give me a chance to solve it myself, thank you.
Yeah. Like the games that particularly make me think of like places you get stuck. The old Tomb Raider games, there are levels that it's just like, if you don't work out the puzzle, like you ain't going anywhere, it's probably one of the first types of first games we kind of started exploring the idea of walkthroughs, and like I have no problem. I want to say I have no problem with walkthroughs. Sometimes I feel defeated a little bit when I first start using one for a game, because I haven't used it at all yet, and then it's like, I'm going to start using one. Yeah. And you feel it's like a little bit of a, a little knife to the heart. But the whole thing is like, once a game's not fun anymore, why am I playing it? So like, if that helps you keep having fun, then cool. So I think so Tomb Raider is one of those, and my sister like played Tomb Raider so much, and she would use the walkthroughs all the time, and she loves those games and replayed them, loads of times. Another like genre, I'm gonna go as far as saying a genre, is like point and click adventure games. I'd absolute devils for this. Yeah. Like the Neverhood is one of them. A slightly more modern point and click game called Machinarium. That is also one, and there's a whole series of those using different characters but the same developer. And there are hundreds more besides, I'm sure. But a lot of those games, you kind of you're plodding along, and it's like, oh yeah, I get it, and these are some fun puzzles, and I work it out, and then I carry on, great. And then there'll just be a stone wall. Yeah. Where it's just like, I do not know. And, I've clicked everything, and I've put everything in the different places, and I've even put things that I don't think should be there in the thing, just in case I was, and that doesn't work, and you're just like, ugh.
And then you look it up, and it's like, oh, I had to give the light bulb to the fox.
Yeah.
Why didn't I think of that? Something really obscure.
Yeah. And some games like Machinarium, I think they have like a bit of a system where you can get a hint, or there's a kind of a bit of an in-game, not quite walkthrough, but like a helpy thing of like, you're a bit stuck. You can't. But yeah, as you said, as with all these things, there's a balance, and but yeah, those are some examples. Like definitely some examples where it's like, old games get it bad, and like even some modern games of like action point and click games like get it wrong, because it's just like you just get stuck and you're gonna stop playing.
On the topic of walkthroughs,
yeah,
do you remember cheat books?
Somewhere I still have one for Pokemon, which definitely fits in this category, by the way. Like really? Like Pokemon Yellow on Game Boy Advance. That's absolutely an old game. And I had like a whole, it's a whole book, like it's kind of a magazine type thing, but it's a whole book, and it's like, here are the places you can catch the different Pokemon. Here's like here's a maze, and by the way, like, if you follow this route, like, this is how you get in and out of the maze, and like, the whole shebang. What was the question? How do I feel about it, or just do I remember?
Do you remember them?
Yeah, absolutely.
Obviously, back then there was no internet, so, or at least for a lot of people, there was no internet. So you would go to a shop and physically buy a cheat book, which would just tell you like cheats, hints, tips, walkthroughs for tons of different games.
Yeah, for real money. This isn't just like a couple quid. It's like I've paid like 10, 15 quid for like this cheat book. Yeah, which is kind of mad. I mean, it's a nice bit of it's an interesting bit of memorabilia looking back. But yeah, it was kind of bonkers now to think about that. But I do still have this. I had roll on a few years. Internet was a real thing. I would make A4 sheets and print them off. I would like collect all the cheat codes I could find for a game, put them on one document, print it off, and then I had them in this like plastic folder where I've got I must have like 30 sheets in there, and it's like rifle through them. What game am I playing? No way. Oh, it's that game, and I pull it out, and it's like it's proper like word art. Like word art is at the top, Like, here is a Might and Magic 3, like in like orange, like 3D font.
Amazing.
And like a shadow, like and then here are all the cheats. So yeah, and you know what, cheats, actually, that's a little little sidebar. Cheats aren't really a thing very much these days.
I was wondering that, like, do you get cheats in modern games?
Cheats and secrets, which were just rife in old games. Cheats and secrets were just everywhere, and I think it's much, much less these days. I really loved that the new Doom games employed. So 2016 employed secrets. There's a secret in every level, and then like there's collectibles and stuff as well. But which is maybe not a new thing. It is not like something that's not done these days. That's kind of, I guess, contemporary. But there are cheat codes that you kind of unlock. It's a bit of a different mechanism. You kind of unlock them, but there are kind of cheat codes that you can put on in Doom Eternal, which I thought was such a cool idea, man. It's like, you kind of you unlock unlimited ammo, and you can like put that cheat code on if you want and stuff, which I thought was such a cool idea because it's just so lost in new games. And well, here's a question for you. Why? And I'm going to front load that with, do you think it's because sometimes games were a bit broken or too hard for most people, and so they needed to have cheats for people to enjoy them?
So I think it's highly likely that a lot of cheats were added for the developers and just never taken out. Because when you're testing a game, you often need cheats. I mean, when we're developing, we use console commands all the time, but they just get stripped from the final game. But also, I remember going back to Disney's Aladdin.
Yeah.
The cheat codes were actually published in the manual because they knew the game was really freaking hard. They knew that people weren't going to be able to beat it in one sitting. So they gave you cheat codes to warp to every level so that you could still experience the game. And there was also no save system. So if you wanted to like get back to a level that you had played previously, you use the cheat code.
Amazing. That's quite nice, actually, because the other games, that was like would have a similar system of like you unlock the like little code, and it will like flash up, and it will flash up on the screen for a few seconds. And if you didn't catch it, tough, buddy. Like that's it. Move. You like if you die, you're kind of back to square one. So like you kind of have like, if you're really organised, you have like a piece of paper and you like scribble down the code. And it's like next time I'm playing, I can like reload to that level.
Did you ever try and guess passwords to get into later levels?
Absolutely. To no avail, ever. Like,
I remember having some success.
Really?
Yeah, there were two games. One was Lemmings, I think, because the passwords were all just fairly simple words, and I think I just tried strawberry, and it took me to like level 27 or something. And another was one of the Spider-Man games on PS2.
Oh, man.
There was a screen where you could enter cheats, and I just guessed I mean, think of the most obvious word that comes to mind for a Spider-Man game.
I don't know, like web or like sling.
Think more spidery, slightly longer than web.
Spidery.
Like what words? Arachnid. Did you say arachnid?
It. Yeah, I said arachnid.
That was it. I just typed arachnid, and that like enabled some cheat. It's just a lucky guess, but that's I quite like that. I think there's a charm in that.
Absolutely, yeah. I think you absolutely must be right about the developer thing though. Like, there's a couple games in particular I'm thinking of where like one of the main cheats is just like skip to the next level, which must just be a convenience factor, for developers. Was like, just need to skip to the right level. 100%.
All right. So I think that's probably all we have time for episode 1. But some great topics here. Nice little introduction to the podcast. Really hope you enjoyed it. And we'll see you in episode 2.